we have an important job. We want to kind of introduce ourselves to some of the core principles and core sociological approaches related to this module. So in this kind of, it might be quite basic, the level we're going at this week, but it's to just build a generic foundation to which then we can then approach the social thinkers from next week onwards. So the first question that we really want to pose and ask is, what is classical social theory? What are we doing in this module? What are we going to look at? Any ideas when we hear the word classical social theory? What is this module about? Well, let's break it down from first. Social theory. Sorry, my writing on the board is terrible. You're going to get used to that. So that is meant to be social theory written there. What is social theory? In its simplest sense, what do we think social theory relates to? What is it trying to do?
The theories about how society functions.
So one key aspect is the function of society. If you think about it, really social theory is about trying to understand the complexities of society. Society is this vast phenomenon. It's very complex with multiple elements, and there's a lot of dynamics to it. So it's really important that as social theorists, we want to understand what this is. And so when we look at this question, this broad question of social theory, it relates to society, the study and the understanding of society. Now, there are different elements of society. Society, like I said, is immensely complex. So how do people associate in society? How do people make friends? How do people join groups? How do those group associations impact their identity? How do we interact with the other? How do, say, for example, migrant communities who come to a new society, how do they merge into that society? Are they assimilated in the dominant culture? Do they resist it? How are individuals like you and I, for example, shaped by institutions? Say, for example, the education system, which indoctrinates us. You can look at different aspects. So at the individual level, how do we create meaning? And then how is that meaning, for example, shared? How does it become collective meaning? How do we all know that, say, for example, money has this specific shared value? We collectively have come to agreement and given it certain meaning. So the objects, people, we give meaning. So society is immensely complex. Now, when we're looking at social theory, yes, we want to understand that complexity. Yes, we want to understand the dynamics of society. But also, we want to ask some really significant questions about society. Like, how do societies form? How are they organized? How are they structured? How do they function? How, importantly as well, do they change? So these are some of the grand questions that we will be looking at throughout this module. And social theory, therefore, in its simplest sense, is the theory of society. How we understand society. So its whole focal point is society. The social thinkers that we're going to look at, their focal point is society. So if the focal point of social theory is society, then another important question that we need to deal with is, well, what is society then? We need to start here. If we're going to study society, if we're going to try to understand how society functions or how society changes, then we need some kind of basic understanding of what constitutes a society. So, in its simplest sense, what is a society? Any ideas? What constitutes, in its absolute simplest sense? Yeah.
Like a structured group or community.
Okay, so a structured group or community or people. What other elements constitute a society? Constitutions, laws. What else would we need for a society? So we all obviously exist within society. We were born into a particular society. We're embedded within a society. We live within that society. Margaret Thatcher famously said that simply society is just made up of individuals and families. But is that true? Can society just be reduced to individuals and families? Is it something more? What is more? Is it just a group of people that constitutes a society? So take, for example, if a group of people, anyone went to London, Heathrow Airport, got on a plane, went to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, does that group of people constitute a society? Would it be a society? When they arrive at Riyadh, they split off and they've arrived into a different society. One might argue that those people that board a plane, i.e. that group of people, it's not a society. While if you boarded a train from Bangor and went to London, that is a society. The group of people that you go on that train with is a society. So how can that be? Board a plane to Saudi Arabia, not a society. Board a train to London from Bangor, you are a society. How does that make sense? Why is one constituted as a society and the other as simply a group of people? So what this means is society has to have certain fixed characteristics, right? Now, where does society begin? Where does society end? So if we look at society, this big, large thing, when you go home, is that your private space? Are you outside of society? When you're in your room, is that part of society? Does society end here? When we're in our room, we have specific objects, we have our phone, we have our laptops. One might say that actually, even though we're completely physically on our own, we are still a product of society. Even the music that you might put on and listen to is a product of society. So how can that be? So if you think of music is really, if you think about it, a personal choice. The music I like might not be the music that you like. It seems like it's a personal choice, but some have argued that even the music that we have chosen, that we like, is a byproduct of society. How? How can that be a byproduct of society? In what way? So if you think about the music choices, the music that we pick or select and that we've liked, basically have been influenced by our position or positionality in society, meaning our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our class, who we went to school with, where we went to school, what year did we go to school, what was, important in terms of music then. All of those factors play a role in the kind of preferences we make, not just related to music, but other things. So society has this huge influence over us, right? But what we're still struggling with is what constitutes a society. So, we said social theory is about the study of society. The object of social theory is society, meaning that's the focal point. That's what we want to understand. Its formation, its structure, how it changes. But before we can do all of that, we need to understand what constitutes a society. So we said back at that earlier example, a group of people board a plane to Saudi Arabia, not a society. Group of people board a train at Bangor Station and go to London, they are a society. So we need to work out why one is a society and the other is not. Now, what makes those people that board a train from Bangor to London a society and not the people on the plane? So let's start with the people on the plane. They're just a group of people, right? From different backgrounds. They board a plane for generally a common goal to go to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and then they disperse. They are not part, that group of people that board that plane are not a society. So what constitutes a society then? So if we look at society, society has to have certain fixed characteristics. So we mentioned some of those fixed characteristics, like things like the law and other things, but let's try to put it all together. Now, if we take our society, our society, what underpins our society, and obviously society first requires individuals. You can't have a society without individuals. Now, what binds these individuals together? Some have argued that there are fixed relationships in society. Social, economic, political, right? Now, these relationships are underpinned by a common agreement. So there is a common kind of criteria, a common agreement that these relationships are kind of bound to, the criteria for them. So what I mean by that, let's take socio-economic. I do not forage my own food. If I need to eat, which is an essential need, I need to eat to survive, I'll go to the supermarket, buy my food from there, and consume it. That is a socio-economic relationship, and it is underpinned by common agreements. So in our society, it's agreed that if you want to exchange goods, you want to buy and sell, then the basis for that exchange is the monetary system, pound sterling, right? So if I go and buy some milk and eggs and whatever, I have to pay that value that society has deemed, yeah? So I have to pay pound sterlings, and then I can get those goods. That is a fixed relationship that I have, and it's underpinned by a common agreement that we have formed. But that common agreement existed well before us, and it'll exist well after us. This is what Durkheim referred to as social facts, yeah? And we'll look at that in subsequent weeks. So what I'm trying to say is society is made up of fixed relationships that we have for our needs. Those can be social, economic, political. Now, the basis, the criteria, or you can call it ideology, is the common viewpoint of our society. So we've agreed upon a set of ideals that regulates how we engage with others, the relationships we have. Now, what function does the state have? So let's say, for example, keeping that silly example, I go to the shops and I decide that I'm not going to pay. I'm going to steal. I'm going to take those things. Now I've broken the relationship between the buyer and the seller. Now how is the seller going to be protected? What protects them from anyone just going and stealing? This is the state or the system which has institutions that uphold the relationships in society. So the state with its laws, constitution, institutions protect people, uphold the relationships and the common agreement. Without the common agreement, we wouldn't have a basis for exchange. So if I went to the shop again and when, I'm going to buy those things, but I'm going to give them a sack of potatoes, they're going to tell me that that can't be done, right? Because that goes against the common agreement. The way we exchange goods is based on pound sterling. So in essence, the common agreement influences how we relate to others and the relationships we have. And we're kind of aware of it, but it's just always been there, right? And the state functions as the mechanism to uphold those relationships. So what I'm trying to say is, a society is not just a group of random people. It is a group of people that have basically fixed relationships. I'm just going to, for purposes, put ideology here, that are bound together. Now let's just say that example of the plane, where a group of people took off and went to Saudi Arabia. Now Saudi Arabia is a different society, but the core of Saudi Arabia is the same. You have a group of individuals bound together by fixed relationships, socio-economic, political. However, in Saudi Arabia, the political system is obviously different. It's a monarchy. We have perhaps a democracy. And the common basis, the common agreement is different. So what would be the common agreement in Saudi Arabia? So its source might be Sharia law. or different cultural, societal aspects of Saudi Arabia. So the fixed aspect is here, that you have individuals bound by fixed relationships, you have a system, you have a common agreement. But these aspects differ from society to society, which will shape everything, but the core ingredients is there. So, in essence, this is a simplistic understanding, because obviously this doesn't take into account the huge complexity of society. It doesn't take into account positionality, for example. So class structure. How does class structure function in this? What about imbalance, the power imbalances that we have in society? So it's just a basic representation of how we might view society. It's not a clear definition. It's basically just trying to understand what binds people together and what constitutes a society. Is there any questions on that so far? Okay, so another part of the module that we didn't really mention, which is the classical, which is an important part. So it's classical social theory, the title of this module. What comes to mind when we hear the word classical? When we hear the word classical, what kind of pops into the brain?
Classical music.
So classical music. What else? So some people, when they hear the word classical, sometimes think, well, classical means old. And the danger with that is that when you think old, you think irrelevant. And we're looking at social thinkers, and in particular their texts, which are, 100, 200 years old. So in essence, we sometimes think, well, old because it's basically linked to the past. Well, then what relevance does it have to me in the modern world? These texts, are for the 18th century, for the 19th century. Are they relevant to modern society? Well, we would argue that they are. Now, why do you think they are relevant? Before we kind of go into it. Why are these texts so influential to this day? Why are they still significant to us today? Why are we still studying these texts 100, 200 years on? So we obviously believe that these influential thinkers have relevance today. And the way we will break it down is that their texts can be broken down into kind of three criteria why they're so relevant. The first is that they're foundational. What do we mean by that? That their texts are foundational. So these social theorists are the ones that ultimately established the discipline of sociology, social theory. They established the core ideas, they established the methods and the approaches, and they solidified sociology as a distinct academic discipline. And so, in essence, that's why they're given this status of foundational, because they established the discipline. So, of course, they're going to be quite key. Also, they are enduring. So, it's that issue of relevancy, that why we think these texts are applicable to the 21st century. Well, take for example, we're going to look at Alex de Tocqueville. He talks about democracy in America. And he made some highly interesting observations about, say for example, the dangers of democracy, such as democracy can sometimes, in a representative form, be the tyranny of the majority. And if you look at modern day democracy, representative democracy, say for example in Britain, we just had the general election, right? And we have a kind of two-party system, but there are other parties. I think Labour, I could be wrong, got around 35%-ish of the overall vote. That means 65% of the UK population did not vote for the party that is governing now. So in essence, how does that work? Is that a good democracy when you have that level of representation? So de Tocqueville and others talk about these aspects of democracy that make it relevant to our situation in the modern. Also, lastly, the issue of canonical. So these theories that have been established, because like I said, these social theorists and their texts established the discipline. What that then means is that their status is very much authoritative. They are the architects of the ideas and the approaches, the methods of this discipline, which makes their text, even though it's written in the 18th, 19th century, authoritative. It has authority because they're the ones that kind of articulated these core points. Another example to put this all into context is Max Weber, because we're trying to make sure that we don't have this idea that just because they are old, they are irrelevant. So, for example, Weber, who articulated a lot of work about the modern world, the transition from the traditional to the modern. And he was concerned, actually, about aspects of the modern world and modern life. And in particular, he said that we've got to be very careful about individualism. So, obviously, he was happy that the modern world took place. Technology came, it changed things, it made things better. But it made us more individualistic, which he said could be a problem. Why is it a problem? Let's look at a quick example. If we take a little bit of a silly example, the evolution of shopping, as an illustration of the danger of individualism. So what he kind of highlighted is this idea that this personalization, as society becomes more and more modern, more and more technology takes over, we become more and more depersonalized. Any idea what that means? We become more and more depersonalized. What does he mean by that?
Everyone buying the same things and increasing their own sense of...
Yeah, so within that consumer culture, we lose our sense of identity and the market forces kind of shape us in a consumer sense. There is that. Anything else? What does he mean by us in modern life becoming more and more depersonalized?
It's not like in like a little village shop, you know the shopkeeper. In Tesco's you can't, when you're going in, you kind of get to know people that work there for like 10, 15 years. When you're shopping online, you don't know them.
Exactly. So this kind of evolution is quite interesting. So for example, kind of exposing my age. I remember when I was young, basically, before supermarkets, the way shopping would occur was basically you would go to your local high street and there would be different shops. You would have the butchers, you would have the greengrocers, you would have the pharmacists, the newsagents, etc., right? And basically, you do, on a Saturday, your whole shopping. And you knew, on a personal level, the greengrocer. You knew, on the personal level, the butcher. You had a relationship. You talked to them. You knew them. And you shopped from them, right? So there was a personal connection. That personal connection created a sense of community. It created a sense of kind of communal kind of atmosphere, that you know everyone. It's a small kind of village type kind of approach, that everyone knows everyone. And there's that kind of connection to the communal, to society. Now, what happens then is Tesco and other supermarkets come along and they take all those different aspects of shops and condense it into one, which is very efficient and very practical for us. So then you don't have to go to each different shop and waste hours. Rather, you just go to Tesco and you buy everything from your pharmacy needs to meat, whatever, right? But you lose that personal connection that you had. So we don't really know the person serving us at Tesco. You don't have a personal relationship with them. So that personal relationship has been eroded. And it becomes even more eroded, obviously, with online shopping and things like Amazon, where at times we can have zero human contact between buyer and seller. So we'll have no human interface at all with the person selling the object. We buy it, we basically order it online and it comes. So what that means is we're completely depersonalized. We're losing our human connection to others, and we're losing our connection then to society, our connectedness, our integratedness. And that can have huge implications on us as well as society. How does society start to function when we're all completely individualistic and depersonalized? Does society have the same kind of emphasis? Because we talked about society being these fixed relationships. Does online shopping completely change those fixed relationships that I mentioned was society? How does it affect us? So technology radically changes our interactions, our behavior, and also society. So what Weber was saying is that things like these forces can be good, the transformative forces of the modern, but they can also impact our behavior. Okay, another set of examples and approaches is how we approach society. So society and the study of society can be done at the macro level, which is the large-scale level, looking at the large-scale changes and processes, and it can be done at the micro level, which is basically the small-scale processes that influence behavior. Now, to give it some examples, so we've got two examples of this. So let's look at the bottom example. Just, it might not be so clear, but what do you think this drawing picture is trying to depict here?
Globalization.
So globalization. Let's look at globalization. It's a good example. Globalization as a process is considered a macro process. It is a large-scale process affecting us at the highest levels. Now, what is globalization in its simplest sense? Any ideas? So, simple way of looking at globalization as a process. Globalization is the condensing of the world through technology. So what does that mean? So 200 odd plus years ago, before satellites, phones, the internet, the world was a much bigger place because the exchange of information took much longer. We didn't know what was happening all the way across the world because we didn't have the technology to have instantaneous exchange of information. So when technologies advanced, and in particular information technology, that condensed the world because now information became instantaneous. So if something is happening across the world now, let's say for example, Israel is about to go into Lebanon, we hear about it instantaneously. If there's a flood like there was in Florida, we hear about it instantaneously. So technology has condensed the world. Information travels instantaneously across the world. What's the impact of that? That the world now has become such a shrunk place that information and technology has made it smaller. What impact does that have? So one consequence is this idea of cultural globalization, which creates a monoculture. What do we mean by monoculture? So this kind of homogeneous, singular culture. We're becoming more and more part of this singular pot. Now, those who have control of the technologies, Western nations, can basically use forces like globalization and technology to promote their civilization, their culture. And that can impact, I don't want to say lesser cultures, but other civilizations or more remote cultures can get influenced by it, and they can absorb that American or Western culture. So, and the way a lot of Western countries do this is through technology and products. So take, for example, this picture. Just a picture of a group of, I'm going to say Afghani kids possibly, or kids in a Muslim country, and they're holding cans of Pepsi. Now, Pepsi, if you think about it, is a way, one mechanism to basically assimilate other peoples into Western culture. Now, how can that be? Pepsi is just a drink. It's a product. You buy it, you drink it. It doesn't carry the ideology of Western civilization, does it? Well, if you look at Pepsi, in particular Pepsi Max, in the late 80s, I'm going to say, or early 90s, I think it was early 90s, Pepsi Max was launched, right? And they launched it on a global scale with this particular tagline, live life to the max. Now, why do we suggest that that might carry aspects of Western ideology or Western civilization? Live life to the max. So you've got two competing civilizations. Let's just say, for example, Afghanistan or the Muslim world and the Western world. Western ideology is actually built on principles like live life to the max. What we mean by that is before life and after life don't really matter. All that matters is this life. You have one life, so live it to the max. And that was the kind of whole advertising campaign. Live life to the max. Because it doesn't really matter about before, it doesn't really matter about after. All that matters is the focal point is maximum pleasure in this life. And that, to some degree, sums up Western ideology after the displacement of religion. That Western civilization is basically focused on this life. That worldview, and that's a worldview, by the way, contradicts possibly the worldview of people in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, for example, they might have the idea that actually before life and after life, what you do in this life determines what happens in the afterlife. So it's basically you have to follow a set of, like rules and things, and so you can't live life to the max. So in essence, what we can say with globalization and monoculture is that globalization is this large-scale process that can influence small behaviors even at the local level, right? So that has this kind of profound impact. The other example, just to show the correlation between macro and micro, is this other example. So basically, about 40, 50 years ago, Arctic hunting started to decline. Now, Arctic hunting, if you're going to categorize it, is a small-scale interaction, right? It's a Inuit practice that basically happens within small communal settings. It's a small social practice. But some have argued that the decline of Arctic hunting occurred because of the Cold War. Now how, and the Cold War obviously is this historical ideological battle between the USA, who kind of promoted capitalism, and you had the former Soviet Union who had communism, and they were locked in this global ideological battle for supremacy. So how does this huge macro Cold War influence the decline of Arctic hunting? How is there a correlation between the two? How can this global process impact the decline of a very small kind of social behavior? Any ideas how? So what happens is at the height of the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and America want to basically spy on each other. What are the other up to? So America establishes a huge air base in Alaska, where a lot of the Inuit tribes were, to establish a large satellite station. And this was a huge air base, huge satellite station, and it needed a lot of people. So in the process to establish this air base, it needed settlement, it needed people. And so when you get people and settlement, you need to have shops, you need to have schools, you need to have hospitals, you need to have, essentially a little city. And they needed some of the Inuit to work there and help as well. So they started to help and gain access to the city. Now, as they gained access to healthcare, food, these things, their populations, the Inuit populations, also started to grow vastly. They had a population boom. Now, the problem was that Arctic hunting could not sustain the population boom, and so they couldn't rely on Arctic hunting to fulfill their communal tribal needs. So they started to decline, and they started to get jobs and things in the city, and so as a result, Arctic hunting now has significantly declined as a social practice. So we can see that a macro level event, Cold War, can influence small scale processes. And that's all that illustration is. Okay, another aspect of what we want to kind of look at is some have described social theory as the purpose of social theory is the scientific study of human society through the investigation of people's social behavior. Another definition is that social theory may be defined as the study of society, which we looked at, that is the web of human interactions and relationships. A key aspect to social theory, to sociology, is to understand patterns and trends in society. So a good example is, let's say for example, the decline of fertility rates in England and Wales. Over the last 60, 70, 80 years, we have seen a significant decline in fertility rates. Now, what is the cause of this? One might say, well, this is just individual preference, right? Women are choosing perhaps not to, have families and settle down. It's individual choice. However, from a social perspective, we know that actually there are social forces that influence individual behavior. So, for example, go back 100 years in the UK, there was the whole kind of society was structured according to gender roles. That men go out and work, women should stay at home and basically be housewives and nurture the children. Now, as things changed, when women were given the right to work and the right to vote and things, basically that meant that they could pursue careers. And so their focus changed. So they wanted to actually go get an education, get a career, and as a result, that meant they delayed maybe having families and getting pregnant. So as a result, what we see is a change in trends or social norms. The old trend that women should stay at home eroded, and we had a new trend of wanting to pursue careers. So in essence, it's the change in social norms that causes a decline in fertility rates, not necessarily personal choice. So there is that intersection between these social trends changing and individual kind of actions. So are there any questions so far? Okay, I know I'm rushing through this. So another important aspect when we're looking at sociology or social theory is that we said society is complex, it's dynamic, and it's, there are multiple components. So social theorists often like to focus on different aspects or areas of society. So there will be those that maybe look at social groups or social institutions and these 6 little things. So it's worth just taking a moment to look at each of these. So let's look at group formation. So one aspect of social theory is social groups. Sociologists are interested in how group formation occurs. Now there are 2 types. There's obviously your primary group, which is the family, where you're often socialized into, your parents socialize you into the household, which is basically you're indoctrinated into right and wrong according to your family household, right? So the norms of society or your culture are ingrained within you. It's that kind of primary socialization. But what's really interesting is group formation within secondary groups. And in particular, if we take, for example, an example there, the football firm. This is actually an interesting sociological case. So in the 1970s and 80s, less so now, there was this popularity of football firms. And what these football firms kind of presented was this dichotomy, really. Because if you took the individual member out of the football firm, and you saw them on a Monday to Friday. On a Monday to Friday, they were normal, law-abiding citizens. Have a job, have family, take the kids to school, perfectly law-abiding, doing their job, integrated in society. Come Saturday or Sunday, the day of the football match, they would join their football firm, and their individual personality that they had on a Monday to Friday would dissolve into the group or collective identity of the firm, which would be prepared to do all types of violence. Go fight with other firms, commit vandalism, do all these things that he wouldn't even think of doing on a Monday to Friday. So what this shows is the power of the group collective. So the individual, his identity is submerged or dissolved into the group identity that can make you do extreme things. This is the type of kind of phenomenon that happens in mob environments where you could be perfectly law-abiding, but in a mob situation, your identity, your sense of right and wrong is dissolved and becomes part of the collective, and you commit acts of violence. So this football firm and the members of it, they were prepared to do all types of violence on a Saturday and Sunday, but come back Monday, dropping the kids to school, back at work. So we can see that there is this kind of shift in identity which is influenced by the collective, the group dynamic. Another example, just to finish off, is social interactions. Society is made up of our interactions. These interactions create experiences, positive and negative, and they have a profound aspect on society. So social interactions, how we interact with other people, right, can shape us, and it can have huge and profound impact. So take, for example, the example of Muslim enclaves. How did Muslim enclaves form in Britain? There is an argument that some politicians will say that the Muslims, or a number of Muslim communities in Britain, are living in parallel communities, meaning they're separate from the dominant culture. They kind of have their own enclaves and these own clusters, and this is separate from the values of British society. They have their own kind of identity and values. Well, how did these enclaves form? Any idea on how these enclaves formed? So, because we're running out of time, when the first generation of Muslim migrants came to the UK, they encountered hostility from the native white working class population. In particular, they experienced violence, they experienced racial abuse, and what that did, that sense of rejection from the majority population, meant that they retreated to the familiar. So if a group of migrants who are obviously a minority, they're being physically attacked, some are being killed, some are being verbally abused by the majority of people, then you're going to retreat to the familiar, which is basically migrants started to form clusters of protection. So their own little communities where they felt safe. And these then would grow. And then when the laws changed and allowed first generation migrants to bring their families, then these communities started to grow. So what I'm trying to say, the formation of enclaves occurred because of that early interaction between the arriving migrants and the native population. That rejection or that hostility forced them to create migrant enclaves. It's much more complex than how I'm simplifying it. But again, social theory looks at things like group behavior, group dynamics, how people interact in society, and how the interactions can radically change behavior and communities. Like, basically, Muslim enclaves have formed just because of that early social interaction. It's a huge impact. Okay, we've run out of time.